the next framework or next iteration that comes out, it's, there's a lot has changed in the world. And oftentimes, like, you're going to see the threats and technology evolve much faster than a compliance framework. And that's by design, because frameworks have to be put together much more methodically.
You're listening to KBcast, the cybersecurity podcast for all executives. Cutting through the jargon and hype to understand the landscape where risk and technology meet. Now, here's your host, Carissa Breen.
Jason, welcome to the show. I'm really excited to have you here today because the topic that we are going to be talking about is something that is super interesting that seems to get a very conflicting sort of opinions on doing security properly versus compliance. So I'm definitely keen to drill into some of your answers around that. But before we do that, we always like to start our podcast off with talking about you and your journey. So please talk to our listeners about where you started and what are you sort of doing now?
Yeah, thank you for allowing me the opportunity to be here today. I greatly appreciate it. And yeah, it's good to talk a little bit about kind of how I started in the field and kind of where I've come now. I guess I've spent my entire career in the cybersecurity field. I think long before the term was even used to define the industry. So I kind of have a unique perspective where I've done a bit of compliance over the years, and then I've also done very technical security operations, kind of for global enterprises. So I have kind of the perspective of both sides of the topic that we're going to talk about today. I've also been heavily involved in organizations like ISACA, where I've been president of the ISACA Greater Washington, D.C. chapter. I continue to serve on the board of directors today as well. So really enjoy a lot of the early days of my career, maybe I was much more in the weeds on things, and now I get to be about a lot more strategic, really help build capacity for cybersecurity learning, growth in the field, information threat sharing, collaboration between different entities, whether it be government and private sector. So really get to do a lot of interesting things. And I truly love the cybersecurity field because I think it just evolves and changes, and it's night and day different from when I started about, say, 16 or so years ago in the field to now. It just, the technology is different. Many of the leading companies that are within the field didn't exist back then. So it's just, it's very interesting and just a really enjoyable field to be in with such dynamic change that I get to kind of be a part of and help be a leader and help organizations kind of overcome challenges, because security and compliance are both difficult things for many organizations to implement. So glad to be a part of the field, and I always look forward to what's kind of coming ahead.
So over your 16-year career, what are some of, you did touch on some of the changes, but would you say from your experience, people are looking at security very differently to perhaps even 10, 15 years ago?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. Just with the amount of technology that's in place today, and you're seeing a lot of the small companies come up with cloud native technology, that those kind of concepts and things you'll see within AWS or Azure or an IBM or Google are not platforms or technology capabilities that were really as prevalent a long time ago, and that you're seeing other things like SIM tools and other technical capabilities that, while now are kind of maybe commonplace, really were not very widely implemented a decade ago. Some of the scripting languages like PowerShell only really have started, I think, in the early 2000s, where now it's like some of these are really baseline technical skills for a lot of administrators. They're used in a lot of exploits. So the same technology or technical capabilities can be used for very good and beneficial things, but they can also be used for exploits. But much of that didn't come about until the early 2000s when the technology started to come into play. So it's night and day different. I think some of the compliance frameworks that we'll probably talk about today have evolved greatly over time as well to adapt to some of these changes. So some new ones come in place as well, like GDPR and just some of the new NIST frameworks that continue to evolve, and the concepts of zero trust and whatnot. So it's really been a lot of interesting change over the years.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And even more so in the last sort of 2 or so years with the pandemic. really emerging and people having to think differently. So, one of the things I'd love to sort of hear your thoughts on is to discuss doing security properly versus compliance. So, a few years ago, I was in the pen testing arena, and you'd speak to clients, and they were sort of just like ticking the box. Let's just do the pen test rather than doing it properly, right? And so I always used to have that discussion with: do you just want to do a pen test to say you've done it for compliance purposes, or do you actually want to find out what your vulnerabilities are, and to then try to create a roadmap for remediation? So I'm really interested because I still do talk to people that are very focused on just ticking the box, next, move on. But I would say more people, though, are very focused on doing it properly. So I'm really keen to open this up. So, what are your thoughts? What are you sort of hearing? What's your opinion on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone strives to kind of have the ideal or to do security and compliance properly. But I think it becomes challenging because sometimes you can have different objectives for different parties in the organization, and you can sometimes run into different roadblocks or just challenges, competing priorities that you end up in a situation where you have pressure to meet regulatory requirements, or if you're a global organization, you have regulatory requirements that vary per country but that you operate in potentially. And then at the same time, you still have to have your security requirements and security controls in place to protect your data, secure your organization, maintain the trust of your customers or clients. So it's a tricky situation where I think everyone's trying to do the best they can with it, but at the same time, you're I think you could fall into these traps with compliance where if you have an annual audit, or it's on some sort of cyclical time frame where you're like, oh, we better hurry up and get everything in order and update our document once a year that we just put on the shelf, and then when the audit's over, we let it go again, and then we go through this process where there's a lot of pressure to get everything done, and to get kind of those check boxes, as you mentioned, with either it be a pen test, or external reviewers come in and you need to produce artifacts and updated documents, and they're checking to see if your procedures or processes are updated. So you can end up in situations where you just go through the motions, but you're not necessarily implementing them as strong as you can, and that can happen, I think, in organizations where you might be short on staff, which often is a challenge in the cyber field with maintaining properly staffed and skilled teams. So you can get in these kind of ruts, or just caught in these going through the motions. Whereas that can then hurt your security posture over time, and it's not deliberate, but it just ends up happening that way sometimes for organizations, where you can kind of fall into that trap.
So, what I'm hearing from what you're saying in terms of the mentality that's derived from this sort of behavior, would you say, like you said, that there's pressure, people are struggling to get their head above the water, keep the lights on, they don't have enough staff? Do you think a lot of just trying to rush, well, not even rush through it, but just, annual audit comes up, we've got to do that, we update our documents, as you said, and then no one sees it again for another year? Would you say that's really the mindset behind sort of what's happening at the moment?
It, I think it can be at times, but ultimately, I think you know you'll see challenges with leaders who you're evaluated a lot on compliance many times, in terms of whether it be an executive scorecard, or um, ways of compensation or success metrics. They're easy to quantify. Oh, I'm green on my scorecard, or I've passed my audit. Where security, over time, it's really, if you didn't get breached or you didn't have a major incident, it's just, life goes on, and people just kind of are like, okay, well, that's what's supposed to happen. It's hard to have real quantitative measures of success outside of the fact that you didn't have an incident that occurred. So it's kind of, it's harder to maybe reward or to incentivize some of those practices versus hey, I've passed my audit 4 years in a row, or I've have all 100%, or in the 99th percentile on my compliance matrix. And so there's ways that I think it just gets harder, and sometimes, and that goes into aspects of just kind of hard to get into the weeds and understand some of the mechanics of the true security operations, technical aspects of security versus regulatory compliance, which in some cases could be much easier to understand at an organizational view or at the aggregate level.
Would you say as well, you did mention like pressure probably from executives. For example, if you're in a highly regulated industry like banking and finance, for example, you're going to have people breathing down your neck. So would you say that executives are sort of very focused on we need to get all of this ready, or else they're going to get sort of slapped over the wrist, or they're going to be the front page in the press, for example. So they sort of then, pressure flows downhill. So would you say that, from a security point of view, that it's like, well, we really need to ensure that we are uh, hitting the mark in terms of the compliance, or else, my executive's going to be on my back, and then that's not going to look good for the company overall. Which there's a bit of that in there as well.
Yeah, I think it definitely can. I mean, that sort of culture or the pressure can definitely flow downhill where there are definitely success measures or executive compensation or even just stature, reputation, and their overall job performance sometimes can be tied to the outcomes of some of these high pressure audits that happen, and they're very point in time where there's leading up to it, during, and after can be very stressful times for everyone who's involved in it, and in some cases, where it pans out really well, it's a really good success story. Everyone's happy, and you can kind of use that to maybe build some positive momentum. But if it doesn't necessarily go favorably, you can end up with a culture that's could be a little bit counterproductive in terms of producing a secure organization, or even one that's going to be able to maintain consistent compliance and get the buy-in and morale that you need. So that also goes back to kind of being, if you're short staffed already, or you're having challenges with retention, and then you kind of add some of these pressures, it continues to compound, and almost kind of can make things even more challenging.
Would you say from your experience as well that certain executives are just very focused on compliance? Again, going back to the point, if they're not compliant, they've got a bigger issue on their hands in terms of the media, rather than sort of doing security properly. Probably because they don't inherently understand it as much as a CISO or head of security would understand sort of the nuances, why it's important. Would you say there's a bit of a disconnect in understanding because there's like, look, we're compliant. I think that's sort of enough. Is that some of the mindset that you've seen in your experience?
I think that it comes down to where you have. I think the executive will say mindset's always good intentions. I don't think anyone's going to come out and say, well, we just want to be good enough and hope nothing bad happens. I think ultimately, they want to drive compliance because they, if you're not compliant, I think they're going to view it as you're going to end up having to maybe divert attention to remediation or having to deal with regulatory oversight, or any of the aftermath. So there's good intentions there to make sure that you are hitting those baseline requirements, that you're not going to have adverse, say, legal ramifications or regulatory ramifications in your industry, so that you can ultimately achieve your business mission, results, and outcome, and be profitable, and value to your customers, protect data and whatnot. But I think there can be that disconnect with technical security, although I think sometimes many people think they could be the same thing, where they really go hand in hand, but they're different and complementary to one another. So I think sometimes, where, as you mentioned, with the CISO or other executives who may come more from a business background, some people can easily think, oh, well, we're compliant, we're definitely, we're secure, nothing's going to happen. Whereas someone who maybe comes from a different background is going to understand that, well, your compliance is one piece of overarching security of the organization, and just because you're compliant isn't necessarily going to mean you're in a very strong security posture. A good example might be, to be compliant, you might need to have a robust risk management program, and you might accept risk that maybe you don't want to accept, or you're tracking and governing how you do vulnerability management, and you might have a pretty good process. But if you have vulnerabilities, or you have risks that you've accepted that maybe if you're taking on too much risk, sometimes that could still fall in the realm of compliance, because you're governing your process effectively. But it doesn't necessarily mean your organization is secure, because you still have that risk exposure that you're accepting, and maybe that's within the guidelines of your organization, or maybe you've taken on too much risk. So there's those aspects as well between the two. But there's definitely some nuances that I think, without coming from the cyber background, you can easily kind of just fall in the mindset of like, well, we're compliant, so we must be secure.
So, on that note, how do we sort of shift the frame of mind from just we're compliant, we're secure? Because yes, people still do think like that. Again, a lot of the reasoning is that, which is what we've discussed today. But how do we sort of get people past that point where we're just really, yes, compliance, like you said, is just one piece to the puzzle, but there's a lot of other things that we need to consider. What does that look like? And how do you start that conversation?
I think it's some of it's going to be at the top down approach. I think you'll see for some of the people entering the field now, they or doing the technical work, they may be doing this firsthand, so they understand. But if you've been in the field for a while, or you've shifted, or you're in executive leadership, and now all of a sudden you have to kind of oversee compliance to an organization or how things work. It's a lot about really educating the C-suite in terms of, how do you manage risk effectively for your organization? How do you drive security for the organization in a way that's going to enable compliance with frameworks, but then also the appropriate investments in security, and using the outputs from compliance to kind of drive investments and prioritize remediation, build roadmaps, and how you can invest and kind of spend your IT funds appropriately. I think a good misnomer sometimes is people think, oh, if we're not, you can use some gaps in compliance to really, we'll say, inform your technology roadmap decisions. Where if you are able to kind of check the box and say, hey, we're in great shape, but really some things are just barely held together, you might be doing the organization a disservice in the sense that you're not maybe going to get the investment dollars, because you don't have the justification to say, well, we need to really invest in these new tools, or we need several $1 million to build out these capabilities. When someone's going to look and say, well, you're 100% compliant for the last 3 years, why should we fund these projects? It doesn't seem like you need them. But really, the compliance aspect could be deceiving. So I think it's a way to like educate executives and leaders about how do you leverage compliance to build up your capabilities. How do you combine security and compliance together so that you have this holistic view of the organization, so that you're governing the risk and exposure of the organization appropriately. And a lot of the top level executive education. And I think now more than ever, that's a area of focus, and kind of at the forefront. I think with all the breaches and hacks that you've seen over the last year or so, and they just get more and more prevalent over time. That I think people realize is that we're kind of at that tipping point or inflection point where it's a huge deal now, where you could maybe brush it aside a number of years ago and kind of skirt by. But I think a lot of people now are they're scared that their company's going to be the next one, or it's going to happen on their watch. And I think you have people's attention, and now is a time where you can really do some good education, or kind of move the needle, in the sense that this is a really good time to drive culture change, because people really have their attention and focus on it.
Yeah, that's so true. So, going back to your point before about sometimes it can do a disservice. So, for example, executives saying, for the last 5 years we've been 100% compliant. Like, why do you need more money or more investment for security? Would you say that happens a lot, or would you say that's sort of an anomaly and that rarely happens?
I think it could depend on the organization. I think sometimes it does happen, especially because frameworks, and this goes back to the difference between compliance and security a little bit. Sometimes frameworks could be in place for a number of years before they get updated. So, when if a new framework first gets released or updated, they still might be a little bit behind where technology or where the threats of security are today, but it's closed the gap a little bit. But by the time the next framework or next iteration of that comes out, it's there's a lot has changed in the world, and oftentimes, like, you're going to see the threats and technology evolve much faster than a compliance framework. And that's by design, because frameworks have to be put together much more methodically. But you're going to get to the point where you're going to ultimately um, still be compliant, but there's just going to be so much new technology out there, and investments and decisions that have to be part of your roadmap for your organization. That if you're just looking at it as, okay, well, we're been compliant with this framework that was published 8 years ago, and we're still, or 4 years ago. I mean, even technology, even 2 years ago, can be a little bit troubling at times. But you're kind of looking back over something that's a little bit dated, and you're saying, well, we're compliant and we've been tracking okay, but the technology keeps evolving, and it's about making sure that even though you might be compliant now, is you need to be compliant in the future too, and you need to be secure today and into the future. So it's about kind of being able to convey that message effectively, and that's, I think, lost on a lot of people, especially in the technology field, where it can be a big challenge to communicate, let's say, some technical concepts, or put together this messaging to a C-suite audience, and kind of break it down quantitatively and qualitatively. What does this mean for the organization, and how do we go forward and sell them on the idea that, these are the actions that need to be taken to put together a vision and a plan for the organization.
Why do you think so many people struggle with the communication? So, if you're a head of security, CISO, and you're trying to get your CFO on board, who is not a security person, why do you think so many people in our space seem to struggle with that, though?
That's a good question. I think sometimes it just comes from the background people have, in terms of, if you've gone up through the technical ranks. You can easily uh, lose focus on some of the soft skills, and um, if you, it's just, I think, it gets a little tricky sometimes, where there's some people who are really skilled at it and it comes naturally, and others it takes practice. And I think it just comes down to the individual, and being able to understand the background and the experiences of the other person. So a CFO, they're going to have a finance background, or numbers, or they're going to want to maybe look at things or quantitatively. So it's like, how do you then present information to them that's going to be maybe more data driven, or something that they're going to really, it's going to resonate with them. If you kind of come to them with maybe something kind of soft or qualitative, that's hard for them to really kind of uh, crunch the numbers around, to say, okay, well, if we don't implement technology A now, well, we're not going to be able to do X later. Or if we are able to implement technology A now, it's going to save us, the equivalent of three resources, or three full-time employees later on down the line. There's ways that, if you can quantify those sort of cost savings to technology investments, and how it's going to maybe multiply or enhance your team. Those are things, that are ways to have the message resonate a bit more, versus just saying, well, we need this to be secure. Where I think everyone's going to say, well, yeah, that would be beneficial, but we don't have the money for that. Or it's like, well, we're considering three projects, and yours really is hard to understand the ROI on. We're going to go fund some other project. So I think that can happen a lot, where you need to really break down the outcomes, and define what does this really mean, and how does this help. And if you can sell the organization on that, then I think that can make a big difference. And um, that's a skill that's learned, and probably tuned over time, where people, if you have a good coach, or you've seen someone do that, or sometimes it comes naturally, but it takes practice. I mean, I'm sure many people have made pitches, and then it doesn't go well, and you just kind of scratch your head and say, what happened here? And then you learn over time. It's like, well, maybe I didn't really convey the benefits of that. I just talked about how important it was, but I didn't really say, well, what does that get us?
Absolutely. And I think you can't paint everyone with the same brush. So, like you said, what's important to a CFO is different to what's important to a CDO. So, you need to really craft that messaging to fit the discourse in which that person operates in. And I think that's a lot of the time where people go wrong. They are very focused on the technology. And like these people, at the end of the day, they don't really care about that. CFO is cared about making money, reducing risk, how much do things cost. They don't really care about the specifics of a technology. And I do see a lot of people very wound up in that. So, and I get that because they care about it and they like it and they enjoy it. So I really do understand where that sort of comes from. So would you say, traditionally speaking, security has really been about compliance versus not doing security properly. But then in turn, that's created an uneven balance and a frustration.
I would say I don't think anyone goes into compliance and security with the mindset of that they don't want to do security properly per se, but sometimes that's a negative output of or a side effect of maybe not doing compliance well. But when you can kind of meld the two together strongly, you get a good output. But I think you can sometimes see um, the frustration of maybe people in more the security operations technical side or administration can sometimes we'll see there's maybe some animosity with people who are solely focused on compliance, where sometimes they feel like they maybe operate and come from different planets, where it's like you're almost talking different languages, where the goal of the security operations or the SOC teams or to really just secure the organization round the clock, process events and incidents, troubleshoot the tools and sensors, and you're continuing and working under a high pressure environment regularly. And then when you kind of then add to that a compliance audit or just compliance activities that need to happen, I think sometimes that you'll see frustration or uneven balance between the groups where sometimes that can happen. I think you can end up with a dynamic where instead of the two teams kind of really working closely in synergy, you end up with, we'll say, siloed departments where you have processes that are documented that maybe don't reflect what's technically happening, or just individuals who maybe don't have as strong technical skills doing compliance and thus maybe not truly understanding what the compliant or the security team is doing. So it gets to be that disconnect at times. But in organizations that do it really well, the teams can work really closely hand in hand and produce a very good outcome. But that will say a more mature, high functioning organization, where sometimes in other cases it can be challenging, where I think then that frustration or stress can come into play and have ill effects as well within the team morale or even just the outputs that the team is producing.
Would you say over time the stress and frustration has gotten worse or better or stayed the same?
I it's I would say that's a bit hard to say because every organization is going to be different. In my experiences, I think it's generally gotten a bit better, or at least stayed the same at minimum. But I think it's just you're the education and the amount of focus on security nowadays compared to say just compliance. I think that you're having kind of people kind of step back and forth a bit between the I'll say disciplines within the greater cybersecurity field. That there's definitely been, I think, more improvement in that regard. So I think personally, in my experiences, I've seen it get a bit better, but I think there's still a little ways to go.
And so when you say there's still a little ways to go, what sort of comes up in your mind when you think of that?
I think it's just it's one of those situations where it's kind of putting yourself in the other person's shoes, and then also kind of understanding the pressures of what one team's going to go through versus the other. You have the technical side who's under pressure regularly to secure the organization, to um, really process and evaluate this deluge of security events that continue to come through, respond to incidents or other high stress or very quick turn events. But then, they that team's going to have to appreciate also the compliance side of things, where the regulatory side is very important as well from a ramification to the overarching business in terms of what they can do in different markets throughout the world and producing profit and being able to deliver services. So it's kind of looking at it from both sides in that regard, just kind of appreciation for one another. But then I think just the education, the amount of resources available for people to kind of build new skills, to invest in oneself. I think some of that has happened. I think some of the college education or universities have offered more programs now over the years where um, you're seeing a lot of the people entering the field have much more stronger technical underpinning and knowledge than those who've maybe switched in from other fields, kind of when we were 12 years ago or more. I think that a lot of people got into cybersecurity from different professions per se, some of which came from a good technical background, others maybe more process or soft skills. So now I think a lot of the people entering the field, because you have degrees in this, and there's majors and graduate programs and research. There's so many avenues for people to um, get educated, to continue to grow their skills, that I think it's a way to kind of help um, the we'll say the middle management and the people performing the work really gain a better knowledge of how each aspect of this is done, and then that kind of flows up as well, where there's the C-suite education. There's some of those people are taking on leadership roles in organizations. So I think it's overarchingly trending better. But it's like anything, it takes time for kind of a greater cultural shift.
Of course, I totally understand that. So, looking forward, will there be a moment in time where we as an industry will hit a tipping point that people will inherently do security properly as well as being compliant? What are your thoughts on that?
It's kind of a tricky question. I mean, you could almost say we're at a tipping point now. It's a year ago you might have said, "Oh, will we have any more high priority breaches than we already have had?" And we continue to always have, I think, always have more. I mean, here in the States with the front page news about the Colonial Pipeline hack, where that was a major disruption. Where I think people are seeing how you can now have significant cybersecurity events, that not just you don't just get an email or some credit monitoring for and someone, your credit card provider provides you a new credit card and life goes on. I mean, there's some serious ramifications to if you're not secure, whether it be major supply chain issues. The solar winds breach had global impacts around the world in terms of the supply chain security that came out of that. I mean, I think we're at that tipping point in this recent times, or the time we're living in now. So if these are the catalysts, or the big moments that really, I think, keep people up at night and say, we need to make investments here. We need to make sure that not only are we complying with the regulatory frameworks, that we're, as an organization, this isn't going to happen to us. And I think that's where we're at today, where I think a lot of the leaders for organizations, take this as serious as you can get it. And if they're not, then it's going to ultimately going to have some pretty bad effects down the line, most likely. So I think everybody, no one wants that to happen, and I think it's a matter of figuring out how do they align that to their governance, their long-term planning, short-term planning, and how do you guide the organization into the future to make sure that you're doing compliance and security in a tightly coupled manner that's going to ultimately secure the organization and manage risk effectively.
So, my last question for you today, Jason, is what would be your advice for executives who are focused on compliance but perhaps just need to broaden their understanding? I mean, you've sort of touched on it a little bit more today, but sort of as a summary, what would you sort of close with?
A few things, really. I think it's okay to understand that there's many things that you're not going to know, and so that building a team of people that are going to be able to help inform your decision making, who can be trusted advisors, I think is really important. To empower and set a culture that's going to enable kind of open channels of communication, proactive, um, we'll say, understanding of compliance and security together, so that you're going to have these dialogues, and that you're going to get the real information. I think sometimes you can end up with an organization that's maybe under a lot of pressure or stress, is that sometimes the some of the key information doesn't go high enough up the chain for leaders to make decisions in a proactive manner. And then when you don't pass a compliance audit, or you have a security incident, you realize, oh well, the team knew about this a few months ago or whatnot, but it never really raised it up to the highest levels. So I think setting that culture where you're going to have that open communication, and then just like anything in life, I think it's continuous learning, continuous personal growth. So even as an executive or a C-suite leader, it's just continuing to grow, to continue to learn from other organizations, to build your education in cybersecurity and risk management, so that you can make those decisions based on the information that your team and organizations providing, so that you can not only drive compliance with regulatory frameworks, but continue the evolution of effective cybersecurity for your organization as well.
Awesome. I love those points. Really, really appreciate it. I think we covered an area that I haven't covered before on the show. So I really do appreciate you spending the time. Your knowledge and your experience has been awesome. And I think a lot of people would really, really appreciate it. If people have a question for you that I didn't ask you today, how can they go about getting in contact with you?
I mean, they could at any point in time contact me on LinkedIn. Always welcome, new connections, increase my network, have further discussion. I always love to debate and dive into different cybersecurity topics. So would be happy to continue discussion.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Jason. Really, really enjoyed the chat, and I can't wait to get you back.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here today and giving me the opportunity. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in. We hope that you found today's episode useful and you took away a few key points. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast to get our latest episodes. If you'd like to find out how KBI can help grow your cyber business, then please head over to kbi.digital.
This podcast was brought to you by KBI.media, the voice of cyber.